chance. I actually had to write a little description of myself for the graduate students in Minnesota, and I entitled it The Drifter, which just means I went from thing to thing. But like I've been able to show with my data, it's probably genetic. My dad actually only went to the 6th grade, but he studied and worked, and I can remember as a kid, he used to go up into what we call the attic, but there's a little room up there, and take extension courses. And he finished his high school education, and then he used to go to the university and take extension courses. And I was interested in science and physics and engineering, but he kept saying, you know, that psychology stuff, that's really interesting. And once I got into school, the University of New Hampshire, I took an introductory psychology course. And I took a course in industrial organizational psychology. And they were clearly just fascinating courses. I mean, so the subject matter grabbed me very, very early. Must have been genetic.
And when did the military come into play? Between after your undergrad?
Oh, actually, no. I went in the military out of high school. I had all the kind of dissatisfaction and curiosity that a young 16, 17-year-old boy has. I wanted to see the world. That's what I wanted to do. And the only way I could do that was to go in the military. I chose that as my avenue. So I went in the military when I was 17.
So you enlisted? I
enlisted in the Air Force, and I'd do it over. It was a wonderful experience. I was an in-flight mechanic on C-124s. I used to fix airplane engines while the plane was flying. And I got to travel much of the world, and I still have strong mechanical inclinations. I fix everything in the house. Until recently, I'd always fix my own car, etc. So again, probably genetic. But that's how I got in the Air Force, and it was a great experience. It was great for me. But I don't think I was in 3 weeks. I was in basic training, and I realized I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. And in some senses, it was the wrong environment. But I had the opportunity to fly a lot. Flew all over the world, and I got to be pretty good friends with a lot of the pilots and stuff. And they all constantly urged me, get out of here, go to college, get out of here, go to college. I mean, it was just really good experience.
Mm-hmm. What did that do for your appreciation of psychological diversity?
I don't think I was thinking heavily psychologically in those days. Mm-hmm. I had a kind of hard science orientation. I read books on physics, chemistry, geology, biology, but not psychology. For some reason or other, I didn't capture that until I started undergraduate school.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I didn't think psychology was a scientific domain, and I discovered very quickly that it could be, and so that shifted me over.
Okay. And after New Hampshire, how did you go about choosing Berkeley?
Well, I went to the University of New Hampshire because that's where I lived. But I really wanted to go to the University of Washington. It was stationed in Washington State, out in the desert, Moses Lake, Washington. And I used to travel to Seattle on a regular basis. I had friends in Seattle, and I knew people there, and I really liked that. And I knew about the University of Washington. It's a beautiful campus, and that's where I wanted to go. But my girlfriend, who's now my wife, actually, worked at Brandeis University for a very, very famous cell biologist by the name of Gordon Sato. Really brilliant guy, a big laboratory, and he used to play, I think, 10 people at chess. They'd have their chess boards, he'd walk by and move the chess pieces, and then go back to work, and then they'd have 2 days to figure their next move. I mean, really brilliant guy. And I headed off with him, and told him what I was doing, and he said, "Oh, you're crazy, don't go there." He said, "Go to Berkeley. Go to Berkeley. You should go to Berkeley." I mean, he really pounded it in, and I had a lot of respect for him, and I said, "Oh, all right, I'll apply to Berkeley." And Berkeley accepted me, and I said, "Well, you know, he's a pretty smart guy. He might be right about this." And I've been in the Bay Area, and I like that too, so I said, all right. So I sort of took advice from somebody who was really competent.
Mm-hmm. In what area did you enter?
By that time, I decided to go into psychology. No question about it. I took a number of courses courses at the University of New Hampshire. I particularly remember a course in industrial organizational psychology, which I really, really enjoyed. And I was an undergraduate in that course, and almost everybody else was a graduate student. And I did very, very well. And I talked with the instructor, and he said, you ought to consider this kind of stuff. And of course I didn't until after I got my PhD, and then I went to Minnesota. Then the IO psychologists were the ones who brought me in. So I obviously, was interested in all of those sorts of things. But my interests are really all over the place. I'm really not a specialist in intelligence, and I'm not a specialist in personality, and I'm not a specialist in vocational interest, and I'm not a specialist in social attitudes. But I've published in every one of those domains, and I sort of know a little bit about each one of them. So I've never been able to focus, let's put it that way. I haven't decided what to do yet.
Was it the personality program that you were in at Berkeley?
No, I was in a social program. My degree is basically in social psychology. Yeah, I did small group research. My dissertation is published as an applied psychology monograph on small group problem solving. But I also had personality correlates of problem solving abilities. It was a mixture of correlational experimental designs, which I still kind of like. But I got only the training I wanted. I'm kind of a compulsive person. I love to tell the story. When I was an undergraduate, I got all the reading lists for the prelim exams. And at Berkeley had 4 days of prelim exams. So I got all the reading list for the prelim exams. So here's an undergraduate. I'm reading all the books and papers. And I'm studying in the same room where they gave the exams. And I'm betting that, I'll get into graduate school here. And I did apply to graduate school, and only 2 of us got in out of quite a few who applied. And at the end of my first semester, I sat for my prelims, and I passed them all. And that means I had no course requirements. I could do what I want, and I just took the courses I wanted, which was really a lot of fun. On the other hand, I missed some things that they would have forced me to take otherwise.
What did you miss?
Oh, I missed courses in factor analysis. Bob Tryon taught some great courses in multivariate analysis, and I think back now, I TA'd for him in introductory psychology, and he was brilliant, and I'm sure those courses were really good for me. So I did miss some things. That was a mistake in some ways. But bring that up. I can remember teaching for Bob Tryon. Bob Tryon basically taught the bell curve for 3 weeks in his introductory psychology course back in the 1960s.
Really?
He argued there was social stratification on the basis of IQ. He had unpublished data that was relevant to the question. He argued it was genetic. He said he'd bred rats to demonstrate that that was the case, et cetera. And I got to Minnesota, and they hired me to teach IO psychology. And they all had qualms about whether behavior genetics would get treated properly in my courses, which was kind of interesting, because I hadn't done any behavior genetics. That was another accident. It turned out one of my colleagues was Irv Gottesman. And Irv Gottesman took me on as a mentor. And so I chat with him in the hallway and say, he'd say, what are you teaching? Well, I'm talking about this. And he says, this was on social class and IQ. Well, there are these very interesting social mobility papers. And there's some like that in schizophrenia. The next day I'd have these papers in my box, so I have to go read them. So when I got to Minnesota, basically I had another instructor who was literally tutoring me. This went on for maybe 3 to 4 years.
Sure.
But that's been one of the great features of Minnesota. I've collaborated with people like David Licken, Alka Culligan. I was telling somebody the other day, I've published probably between 20 and 25 papers with David Licken and Alka Culligan at different mixtures. And we never had a disagreement in 20 years. We just worked it out. I mean, to have colleagues that you can discuss intellectual issues with and then sit down and write papers, run back and forth, is probably one of the greatest things you can have in academia. So in some senses, I've had the best academic life you could possibly have.
With Tryon at Berkeley, was there any contact with Art Jensen during that?
Had no contact with Art Jensen at all, but Art Jensen had a lot of impact on me. In fact, I was asked by somebody maybe 10 years ago, you know, who were the most important influences, and Art turns up on the list. There's just no question. Because shortly after I left, I went down to Santa Barbara. I taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara for 3 years, and I taught a course on intelligence. I used J. McP. Hunt's book, Intelligence, and I was very unhappy with it, but it was really the key book. But I said, you know, these arguments don't make sense. Some of them are wrong. His attacks on genetics were convoluted, and I didn't think very sensible. And Art's paper came out, his monograph, and I read through it, and I said, this is the way you want to do science. I really love that monograph. And then I started to see all the holes in the Hunt book. Although Hunt was a very smart guy, and there were a lot of interesting things in the book. I don't think he got the genetic idea right. He just couldn't get it right. And he was I think he had an ideological bias. So I started to think about behavior genetics after Art's monograph came out. So that's what sort of put me in that direction. When I went to Minnesota, I considered doing twin studies, but David Lincoln already was doing studies. And I said, you know, you just got to horn in on a colleague who's sort of defining that area, and it's just not right to do that. And David was over in psychiatry. I knew him, but he wasn't in the psych department at that time. But I chatted with him regularly. So I started to do some family studies. We did a few family studies. Mark McGee, one of my students, did a big family study on spatial ability that appeared in the psych bulletin. But I realized it was weak. You really needed the right kinds of designs. And I actually talked with David and Alcatelligan in the faculty club a number of times over the years about how we might do a study of twins reared apart. And we talked about it, and we said, there's just no way to find these cases. It's not possible to do it. So I had this idea in mind, but it just never came to fruition because we decided it was methodologically too difficult. So I was getting dragged into genetics, and I wasn't completely naive. My advisor had been Don McKinnon, who, by the way, is very psychoanalytic, and that never took. That just never took. But he passed me on to Harrison Goff, and Harrison Goff made me read the Fuller and Thompson textbook, the first textbook in individual differences. And so I sort of had that in the back of my mind. I knew what the kind of designs were. I knew you could do animal work. I knew you could do human work. And, so sort of seeds were being planted. The IO psychology seed was planted in University of New Hampshire. I did respond to my instructors, obviously. When I got to Minnesota, John Campbell took me under his wing. Here was a place where other faculty would actually mentor you. He said, you know, I need an associate editor. I'll train you how to be an editor. And I'd sit down with him week after week. And I was the associate editor of Journal of Applied Psychology. So I did IO psychology. I taught courses in IO psychology. But I got to say, once I decide I kind of like something, I enjoy it. I have fun. I loved IO psychology. I still talk with the IO psychology students on a regular basis. But some things I just don't do. I gave up social psychology as hopeless.
So how did the twin study start?
Oh, complete accident. I teach about twin studies and differential psychology. You can't not teach about them. And one of my students, Margaret Keach, you know Margaret, one day saw a story in the Star Tribune, local newspaper, and she stuck it in my mailbox. And another person in the department, Gil Peterson, saw the same story. He also stuck it in my mailbox. So I came in one day, I get these two cutouts from a local newspaper story about a pair of twins reared apart. So people obviously saw me as the natural target. And I said, you know, this is really interesting. I said, every psychologist ought to do a case study. And I said, this is better than a case study. Two monozygotic twins. I said, this will be my case study. And I said, you know, you do a case study, you can't just give a few tests. I give the CPI and they'll say, well, look, that's just one test. You know, maybe they're similar by accident. I said, I got to give 3 personality tests, and if they're all different tests and they all give the same results, then it'll be more convincing. And I said, I have to do that for more than one domain. I don't really do all of individual differences. And I said, and why don't we do a little bit of psychiatry? And then why don't we take them over to David Licken's lab and run their EEGs? And so, you know, within a couple hours, I had this big plan in mind. Of course, I had no money. I had no idea how I was going to get these twins, but I remember working this all out. So I went over to psychiatry and talked to Len Heston, and Len said, Bouchard, this is crazy. One pair of twins is of no value whatsoever. I said, but you know they're interesting. I said, you've got a pair of monozygotic twin daughters. He did. And he said, oh yeah, you know that. And he'd done a study of homosexuality in twins, and he'd done an adoption study on schizophrenia. I said, you know how valuable this can be? He said, yeah, but one pair of twins is not going to do anything. I said, Len, humor me. Do me a favor. And he said, all right, I'll do a psychiatric interview with him. And I went over to see David Licken, but David Licken said, oh yeah, fine, you know, we'll just run through the paradigm. He and Alka were developing the MPQ at the time, and David had a couple tests. So I had those 2 guys lined up, and I talked with Herb Gottesman. I said, come on, you know, what are we going to do? And he said, well, you got to give him the MMPI. No question about that. So things started piling up, and pretty soon I had about 6 days of assessment. And then everybody said, oh, no, that's way too long. That's way too long. Cut it back. Everybody advised me to do 2 days. And I said, I'll do 4. So we set it up for 4. And then I went after the twins. I mean, I was kind of doing both in a sort of mixed fashion. So I picked up the phone and I called the Associated Press, because it was an Associated Press story. Talked to the woman and she said, oh yeah, I know about those twins. I put that story on the line. Actually, I called Minneapolis and they contacted Cincinnati, and that's where it was. She said, I put that story on the line. And she said, why are you interested? And so I said, oh, these are incredibly valuable scientifically. They're extremely rare. I mean, I went on and on. She said, well, how are you going to pay for this? And I said, oh, I don't know. I said, but I'll beg, borrow, or steal, but I'll get the money. And I haven't even talked to the twins yet. I'm using her as the vehicle. I've talked to the graduate school, but I don't have any money. Next day, there's a story, inside page of the New York Times. Psychologists will beg, borrow, or steal to study twins. And that was really a key. By then, I got their phone numbers, but they were off partying somewhere, so I had to talk to them when the story appeared. I said, oh, they see that story, I'm dead. But I did get a hold of them. They didn't see the story. But the editor of People magazine saw the story. The editor of People magazine is a twin. You may not know it, but twin stories appear in that magazine regularly, and they do because the editor's a twin. So he sent a stringer to Minneapolis to write a story about our assessment. And New York is very incestuous. All those people talk to each other. So somebody at NBC heard about it. They said, oh, well, we'll send a TV camera. So they sent a TV person. So there's an NBC story. Friends of mine were in the Cayman Islands. They said, hey, we saw you on television. Well, that pays off because within a couple of days, the Johnny Carson show wants to talk to these twins and put them on the Johnny Carson show. Well, they were on the Johnny Carson show, and then we start getting letters from other twins. I said, hey, we've got a method. And then, I don't know the dates exactly, but within a reasonable period of time, I get a letter from a group called the American Adoption Congress. And they say, you know, you're studying genetic things, and all of us adoptees, we know there's something genetic going on, because when we find our biological parents, there's a lot of similarity, and we're different from our adoptive parents, and so we'd like you to give a talk. So I went there to give a talk. Well, there's a woman who lives in Reno, Nevada. She runs what's called a reunion registry. She said, oh, I unite twins. Sometimes a twin will write, and I'll look through my records, and I get a match, and it's a pair of twins. So she was able to get us a couple of pairs of twins. That group put me in touch with a group in England, a group in New Zealand, and a group in Australia that do the same things. So now I was developing a worldwide network. And you can see, I have no responsibility for any of this. It's just luck. But it's serendipity. You follow up one lead, it leads somewhere else, and if you're open to the possibilities. Now, a lot of these things took a lot of work, but it wasn't because of my high G. That was not part of it at all. It was just that things all kind of meshed. And then somebody in England, this is about 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road.
And what year is this now?
Well, we're talking now, this started in '79, so 82, 83. By then, we probably had 12, 13 pairs of twins. Now, I was still kind of begging people to let me run these twins through the lab, because they're saying, look, case study, sure, but you'll never get a big enough sample to do anything systematic. So I said, I don't care, I'm a full professor, I can do what I want. And I said, it just doesn't matter. And that's what I've always done. I've always done precisely what I want. I mean, you couldn't be more lucky. You know, I've just gone off and done what I wanted, and it's been fun. So I got Dave, and David was easy to persuade. Len Heston was a lot harder, so then I had to get one of his colleagues, Elke Eckert. She started to pick up the psychiatric interviews, etc. And then very early on, she said, you know, why don't we do a few more things? So we added pulmonary, we added cardiovascular, we added allergies, we added eyes, and pretty soon I was dragging the twins through all of these laboratories. And all of these people at my university were doing it for free. I mean, it was no question. Because after 2 pairs of twins would go through anybody's labs, they'd say, this is incredible. These people were reared apart. And mostly in the early years we were getting just identical twins. But fraternal twins turned up too, DCAs. And they were perfectly happy to look at those if they could see more of the other kinds of twins. So in a sense, the twins themselves really persuaded all the investigators to. So I got millions and millions of dollars worth of work in the hospitals for virtually for free. And one day, Nancy Siegel, who worked with me for about 9 years, was having her teeth done over at the health center. And the guy's chatting with her, and he said, what do you do? And she said, oh, I work on this fascinating project. Nancy was more excited about it than I was. I mean, she's great, you know. And she starts telling, you know, this guy says, oh, you know, us guys over in the dental school, we've been talking about these twins for years. She said, you know, we thought about talking to Bouchard. And she said, oh, talk to him, he'd be happy, you know. Next day, I get a phone call from the head of the dental school, you know, saying, you know, could we look at some of these twins? And I said, sure, you know, we drag them. I mean, they were doing a lot of stuff. They got a lot of money. In fact, they got more money to do the dental work than we had. We spent in the first 5 or 6 years, literally. I mean, so they paid to bring in a lot of twins. And the guy that did Nancy's teeth did his master's thesis and his PhD on our twins, then incorporated our regular, by then we'd already started to set up a regular twin registry. David and I wrote some NIH grants to start a twin registry, so the Minnesota Twin Registry came out of that. And the dental people helped us with that, and then started studying ordinary twins as well as twins reared apart. So they did a big twin project. And that guy's now a full professor in the dental school. So it's kind of a lot of fun. But what you can see is I really can't take credit for much. It just kind of all happened. I guess in a sense I'm a Skinnerian. You know, it's all the things that happen outside that determine what you're going to do.
The content.
Yeah. It's so it all went very nicely. The biggest problem was I don't think I ever had a grant for more than 1 year at a time. So I just had to. And you can understand that. There was no way I could demonstrate I would get more cases. I mean, there just was no way. You couldn't say, you know, fund me for the next 3 years, and if cases turn up, then I'll study them, you know. So what you can see is we don't have a funding apparatus for this kind of serendipitous sort of stuff. And I mean, it makes sense. Of course, we also got some very critical reviews. This will never tell anything, et cetera, et cetera. But I've always thought there was kind of a hole in funding possibilities. And actually, one of the nice things I think about the United States is we have a lot of private funding. And that's where I got most of my money. That's another very interesting story. One of the things I'm going to get across to you is how great the University of Minnesota Psychology Department is. I mean, I think it's one of the greatest psychology departments in the world. I brought in that first pair of twins, and the chairman of the department was Jack Darley. You know Jack. And the twins were coming around the department because we were bringing them from lab to lab and stuff like that. And then the story appeared, and Jack came down and said, "Come to my office, we have to talk." So I got down to his office. He said, "You need to write a grant." And I said, "Write a grant?" He said, "You're going to find more twins." And I said, "Well, you know, that's possible." It hadn't occurred to me. Again, I'm not responsible for much. And I said, "You know what, you're probably right. You know, I thought about it." He said, "Let me make some calls." So he made a call to Chicago. I'm trying to think of the Spencer Foundation. Turns out the head of the Spencer Foundation was a friend of his. And he came back down to my office. He says, this might have been Wednesday. He said, "They're meeting Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday, to review grants. You have to have a grant in their hands." So I sat down and I wrote a grant and got it out. And the Spencer Foundation, I think they gave us $50,000, enough to do 3 more pairs of twins. If you think about it, we were bringing twins in by this time, we'd already made some contacts with England, where our first overseas twins came. And if you average it out, it was costing us something like $20,000 to $25,000 for a pair of twins. And again, point out how serendipitous all of this is. That's because, in fact, we were bringing, in many cases, their spouses. And that's given us a lot of power. It's given us a sample of non-adopted individuals, because most of the spouses are. So we have individuals raised by biological families, and we have individuals who are adopted, and then we have assorted mating data. Well, you know, if you read the genetics and behavior genetics, you know that's important. But that's not because I thought about it. The first pair of twins wouldn't come unless we brought their spouses. And I really didn't have enough money, but I brought them anyway. And then I realized that's a powerful inducement. It makes it, especially for adults, people in their 50s and 60s, et cetera, they're going to come with their spouse, et cetera. So we built that into the grants and into the funding requests. But it was because that pair of twins insisted on it. So that was just luck. Just luck.
Interesting.
And by the way, I had served on the Graduate Research Advisory Committee for the University of Minnesota, which actually gave money for small research projects between $5,000 and $20,000. And back in the 70s, 60s, that was good money. And I knew the dean sometimes took grant requests and would fund them out of that kitty, and then we'd review it after the fact. So I applied to them, and that's where the first money came from. The first money came from the graduate school of the University of Minnesota. So you can see that institution had all kinds of mechanisms and people in it who just provided the necessary support. It would have been very difficult to do at a smaller institution or somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Looking back at your study, what would you say are among the most significant findings that come out of it?
Well, I think the most interesting findings were our findings with religion. And now I'm doing in much more detail social attitudes. When Linda was talking about how you have an ideology or a particular point of view, when I was setting up the assessment, I remember going to my bookshelf, and I was trained as a social psychologist, so I took a book off called The Measurement of Social Attitudes. I still have it. I went through this, and I said, these are all things that you get from your family and from, you know, your family. I remember just saying, this is stuff like that. I don't know why I thought that. It must have been because it's just the assumption you carry. And I remember thumbing through the whole thing and actually looking at the F scale, authoritarianism scale. And I said, you know, it's a waste of time. There'll be no similarity, get nothing. Why do it? Be wasting the twin stuff. Put the book back on the shelf. Well, years later, 1986, I get this paper in the mail from Nick Martin, paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and they did a twin study in London, they did a twin study in Richmond, they did a twin study in Australia. Social attitudes are as heritable as personality traits. And they actually, one of the few times where psychologists actually commit themselves, they fit models and they said, okay, we predict that the heritability of conservatism in monozygotic twins part will be 0.62. I mean, so our hypothesis is testable and refutable. You know, I thought, this is interesting. But I don't have any social attitude measures. I was stupid. I assumed the answer to the question ahead of time and didn't systematically put it in. But then I started thinking, I said, but you know, I got some things like that. I said, the special MMPI scales have a religious fundamentalism scale, and that's kind of in that domain. And I said, you know, that's not true. I do have some things. I had the Allport-Vernon-Lindsay study of values. And I had the Rokeach. I had put the Rokeach. Again, almost total accidents. I had a big file from my graduate student days, and I had saved every test I had ever worked with or studied or written about. I'd always get the test, get the manual, and I just had a big file of all these tests. So I said, and I had been at the Institute of Personality Assessment and Research at IPAR, so I gotten all the tests IPAR had used. I had all that stuff in my files. I guess I was really a differential psychologist, because here I am collecting all the instruments. So I went through all of those tests while I was setting up the assessment. And I looked at the Rokeach, and I looked at the AVL, and I said, well, you know, and so I put them at the end of the battery. And we learned how to run these assessments. I mean, it takes a lot of practice, and you got to figure out how much people will put up with, and before they come exhausted and refuse to take your tests anymore. So we started off. They had Wednesday. They came in on Saturday, and we started late Sunday afternoon, kind of eased them into it, and then we did Monday and Tuesday. They had Wednesday off. They did Thursday and Friday, and then they went home. Well, pretty soon we came in earlier on Sunday. Pretty soon Wednesday disappeared. Pretty soon they were working Saturday morning, and instead of coming in at 9 o'clock, they came in at 8 o'clock. Instead of going home at 4 o'clock, they went home at 5:30. So as we figured out how to do this, we expanded and expanded. So we kept adding tests at the back end, so our ends vary as the sophistication of the assessment. But we had we'd have an RA accompanying them to the dentist. So if the dentist wasn't ready, they had a psychological test. I mean, we did let them go to the bathroom, but they had to ask. So we did expand, but there was a lot of learning that went into it. And some of the tests were included. I was telling somebody the Rokeach was added because I thought, you know, we got thousands of true-false questions. We've got to have some variation in the format. And the Rokeach has got a nice stick-em format. You know, you move the values up, and you decide which ones are more important. And the Allport-Vernon-Lindsay has got a nice different format, etc. I was surprised how standardized a lot of our formatting is for psychological testing. It really could use some variability. In fact, it occurred to me then more than ever. I mean, there's just no justification for all personality tests just being true-false tests. They could have a section of adjectives. They could have a little section of, you know, sentence completion. Multiple methods of gathering data. Every psychometrist knows, a psychometrician knows that that's a desirable feature. Why are all our personality tests this kind of standardized form? It's not excusable. And it sure would make assessments easier and more fun. The one test that does this to some extent is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I have in my assessment battery as well, because my advisor, Don McKinnon, was a Jungian type, and I had those tests as well.
Where do you see that
Well, we tried to do some. We actually brought something like 40 sets of twins back, but we just never got the funding for it, and I just got too old. One of the longitudinal studies are, I think, terribly important, but they outrun the lifespan of an investigator. And it's, I was talking to my wife about this a couple of weeks back. When I was running this twin study, there were periods of literally months where I worked 18 hours a day. I mean, I'd run home, lie down, then the alarm clock would go off, and literally there were times when I was so physically exhausted it was hard to stay awake. And then I'd sleep for 3 days. You can only do that when you're young. I mean, I look back and I can't believe I did it. And of course, my wife says, "Well, you don't know the other side. I've never laid eyes on you." I was pissed. And you did nothing but that. I mean, I did assessments on Easter. I did assessments over the Christmas holidays. I did that. If that's what it took to get the twins there, that's what we did. And sometimes no staff would come in. I spent Christmas Day one year assessing twins, and no staff would come. I had to do everything. So, I mean, sometimes that's just what it takes to get a project done. But every bit of it was fun. Even when I was so exhausted, practically drive off the road on the way home.
What did your experience with that study and your reading over the years do for you in terms of how you now conceptualize the environment?
I don't think I've solved that problem. There's no question environment is important. There are no heritabilities at one or anywhere near it, actually. And some of our heritabilities probably overestimate. So there's environmental variation. But it's really, I mean, behavior genetics has shown it's much less systematic than people think. It's certainly not the shared environment. I think we underestimate that too, because we don't have enough different methods, and we're not sampling the environment adequately. But the environment works in a much different way than I think most psychologists have ever thought. Certainly in terms of child rearing, in terms of SES, in terms of schooling. I mean, you don't just look at the behavior genetics literature. Poor sociologists are still trying to figure out how the environment works as well. And I kind of allude to that in a paper that just came out in Current Directions in Psychological Science. If you actually review the entire biological literature, the vast majority of quantitative traits or complex traits are heritable, and they're of moderate heritability. It's almost as though this is a function of the way biological organisms are put together. I think there's some just general kinds of phenomena going on with regard to how biological organisms are put together, how DNA expresses itself in organ systems, etc. And that it has to be that way, because although evolutionary thinking says, the environment selects for traits, and if they're adaptive, the mutations accumulate and spread throughout the population. Environments aren't a fixed thing. Environments fluctuate dramatically. Organisms move around in environments. There's a range for any given species. I mean, we don't live in the same environment as beavers do or that birds do. But there's just a lot of flux in the environment. That means you have to build an organism that can respond to that flux. And I think the answer to that question is going to be in the way the organism is built, not in the environment. So you can see I'm not a big environmentalist in the sense of the environment. It's also the case, as Linda was pointing out, I've come to the view that we create our environments. And not just us, but other organisms. The example I like to give, because I live on a lake, and we have both marmots and beavers. And I tell the students, look, they're both mammals, they're both rodents, but the beavers got genetic programming. And they search for water, they build their homes in water, they cut down trees around water. The marmot, which is an animal looks very, very similar. Looks for high ground, looks for places water will not get in, because if water gets into their tunnels, they drown, their offspring won't survive. They tunnel underground, so they've got some similarities to the beaver, but they gather food in a totally different way. And the little marmots don't, the mother marmots don't teach their little marmots, and the mother beavers aren't teaching the little beavers. These are niche-seeking, genetically driven kinds of things. They are what I like to call experience-producing drives. It's clear they learn, I was a student at Berkeley. I took the physiology course. And they really let you do things in those days. I and another guy had a dog. We removed the skull cap. We did all the operation, exposed the brain. And I can remember saying, you know, I would really like to do this with human beings. Literally. I said, this is the master mystery, the brain. And I thought about it, and I said, you know, I really considered going to medical school, doing neurosurgery, etc. And I said, I'm married, I had one kid, and I said, I can't do it. I got 4 years in the Air Force, I've got to get a career, earn a living. And so that was a cut point. I still remember crystal clear, that I didn't do. And that's an alternate career I could have gone into, and I know I would have loved it. I would have loved it. And I read all the fMRI literature. I keep on top of it. I mean, so you can see it, you know. But I still look at the IO literature too. I can't focus.
Tom, what are you proudest of in your career?
Oh, I'm proudest of working with students like you, and Matt McHugh was one of my students. Wendy's going to be one of my students. I think teaching people how to do it right, do it rigorously, and ask interesting questions. I think, like I said, you know, social psychology just, for some reason or other, most of it is trivia. And a lot of psychology is trivia. And there's a certain arrogance when you say that, because, you know, certain things do turn out to be very important later on, and you hadn't thought about it. So, but how to get people focused on real interesting problems is Paul Meehl used to have a statement. We bring in people for consideration for positions, and he says, they got to turn you on intellectually. They got to convince you they're doing something really interesting. They've got a real handle on it. They understand it, and they're going to learn something. You know, and you got to get that kind of a focus. And that biases me just terribly. I think that's how I feel about it.
How does you've integrated evolutionary concepts into your work?
I teach evolutionary psychology
From time to time.
Actually, that's an interesting story. You want to hear that one?
Yeah.
My colleague, Nancy Siegel, had a very strong interest in evolution, and she got it because she got her degree from Danny Friedman at the University of Chicago. It was an early, very early evolution. He was doing it when it was just absolutely controversial and completely unacceptable. Of course, I like unacceptable things. That's why I went to jail in the free speech movement. You know, if it gets people aggravated, they must be interested and they must think it's important. So that's a kind of a key indicator. But she kept saying, you know, you got to read this. You got to look at this. Nancy, I barely keep my head above water, etc. But she'd give me a paper and she'd say, well, you know, we should think about it this way. And finally, I said, you know, I sort of gave in. I started to read it, and I said, hey, I really like this stuff. Now, that's, again, the seeds go way back. There don't seem to be any doubt about that. So maybe there are environmental influences, but I can remember in taking sophomore biology in high school. I mean, I remember dissecting a pig, taking every piece and every muscle and all that. And I remember that being one of the, I guess I like to cut things up, don't I? Think about that. But I remember just absolutely loving that course. That was one of the best courses I ever took. And when I was a student at the University of New Hampshire, I might have been a sophomore. I only went a year and a half there, but they were developing a new biology exam, and they were trying to recruit students from other disciplines, and I was kind of in psychology. So a whole class was asked to take this biology exam. And it turns out I got the highest score on the exam. The guy who was developing the disc came over and said, you know, you're the guy who got the And I said, but I'm not taking any biology courses. So that told me, you must be interested in this kind of stuff, because I read it when I was in the Air Force, flying on airplanes. I read about biology, et cetera. And I still read science from cover to cover, but mostly the biology stuff, genetic stuff. So I must have a experience producing drive in that particular domain. But you really do have to focus to some extent. But once Nancy Siegel pushed me kind of over the cusp, I have now a whole bookcase full of books on evolution, evolutionary psychology, but I've always liked this. One thing I've always really aggravated me. I went to Catholic schools and I didn't learn anything about evolution. And I thought about that, and that really pisses me off when I think back about that. That's a very important intellectual topic, and people with religious biases really, I think, corrupt young minds by not teaching them some real things about the world.
Well, this has been very enjoyable. We've gone for an hour, and
I'm just getting warmed up.
Well, we're not going to stop now, but the audience has been promised that they get you for 30 minutes to ask you whatever they want. So I'd like to open this up for questions. Yeah.
Okay, you've done a tremendous amount to establish the heritability of intelligence, personality, a number of other things of that type. You more or less just nailed it down along with others. What's left out there to be done in that domain?
The question is, what's left to be done scientifically beyond the heritability of traits?
Well, it'd be nice to know what the environmental influences are. And I pointed out I have a particular theoretical point of view that it's just something about the way you put biological organisms together, otherwise they don't survive in an evolutionary sense. I'm not sure whether psychologists can tackle that problem or not. So that's an interesting question. Another very, very interesting question is the interface between the environment and the organism. What is that interface? I mean, Galton, pointed out that his critics said, well, it's all kind of complicated, but he was right. You can partition the variance in two ways and get estimates. But the fact is, genes alone are nothing but a damp spot on the floor. Genes have to express themselves. They have to basically engage in the creation of an organism. That organism has to survive in its environment. It has to transact with that environment. Notice I use the term transact, not interact, because interact implies something quite different. Mostly organisms transact with their environments. And how all that works is, I think, a fascinating problem. And of course, that's the problem of signaling systems between cells, signaling systems between neurons, etc. We know virtually nothing about that. We don't know how even the simplest organ systems are created. In fact, there's a guy giving a talk at the University of Minnesota over in the neuroscience department. Gave it this afternoon, in fact. How does Drosophila create the salivary gland? The salivary gland in Drosophila is a very important gland, okay? They know a couple of signaling genes and a couple of instructions to work, but this kind of simple organ. We've got a few ideas. We know Hox genes create the order of vertebra and vertebrate animals, and the same genes actually work in Drosophila, but how you turn them on and off, how they know when to stop, those questions all apply to how you build brains. And the brains are what mediate behavior. So I tell my students, I can give you this stuff about 50% of the variance is genetic, 50% is environmental, but I can't tell you. There's major mysteries to be solved.
If I can just have a follow-up on that. Let's look now at genes. From Mendel on, we were able to make these kind of statistical predictions, and then Fisher made that even more precise. And we've had many fine talks today dealing with intelligence and factor analysis. And for those who have eyes to see, we can see that G predicts an awful lot in the real world. But how close are we to understanding what intelligence really is? In the case of genes, we didn't get it until Watson and Crick started playing with jigs and putting it together. Are we even close to that in intelligence?
Are we even close to understanding the underlying process?
I'm not sure that's the way one ought to pose the question. For example, like I remember walking by someplace in Florida the other day, and they said, it was a magazine that says, you know, are viruses alive? So you can really ask the question, what is life? Well, is that a real scientific problem, or is that just a kind of verbal problem? If we know how to build viruses, and we know how they work, and we know how they infect more complex organs and organisms and kill them, what does it mean to ask, well, is the virus alive? Is the host alive? That's a semantic problem, in my opinion. And so in a sense, asking what is intelligence or what is personality, I'm not sure that's a scientific question. You get my, if I know all the consequences and I know how to put it together and take it apart, I know how it works. It seems to me the task of science is answer the question, how do things work? And if you can do that, so if you can say, here are genes, here's how they are expressed, here's how they build an organism, here's how a brain is built, here's how a brain transacts with the world, and here are the outcomes, behavioral and other, you've solved the scientific problem. The kind of question you're asking, I think, is more metaphysical. Now, I'm not a philosopher, so I may be just completely off base on that, but that's how I think about I think working scientists think about these things a little differently than philosophers and reporters.
Buzz?
I'd like to follow up on that for just a minute, Tom. I gather from what you're saying that you would regard what is intelligence at the brain molecular level as not being a scientific question, but that you would regard the question.
No, why not?
But no, that what is intelligence wouldn't, but that you would be quite happy with the scientific question of what is the mechanism for control of attention.
Absolutely.
Or what is the mechanism for holding information in working memory?
Yes, yes. What are the brain circuits? And then intelligence is, we get a measure, we call intelligence, because of the functioning of those mechanisms. And so I'm a mechanist, I'm a reductionist at heart. There's just no question about it. And I think you do science piece by piece. You try to run as many comparisons as possible. I really hate the constant just one control group. Actually, we always have more than one hypothesis about things. And if we had more than one kind of control or comparison, we'd probably learn more in every single experiment. So I think we kind of do some of this stuff wrong. But yeah, I'm a mechanist. What are the mechanisms? What are the mechanisms? And then I think if you can tell what the mechanism is, you know what's going on. Putting it in what is intelligence is a little, it's not answerable from my frame of reference.
Art?
You're thinking of the mechanism of reduction as physiological, chemical sense, not in terms of mentalistic concepts.
No, I think every mentalistic concept is encoded in the brain. It's like there was an interesting story in Time magazine recently about the God gene, etc. And my colleague Lyndon Eaves was asked a question. Some neuroscientist said, well, God is in the brain. And the reporter said to Lyndon, well, what do you think about that? And he said, of course it's in the brain. It's not in the big toe. I mean, mentalistic concepts have to be in the brain. Otherwise, you have to be a dualist and say, well, there's two spheres, and I'm not a dualist, I'm a reductionist. Not that philosophers, a lot of philosophers argue that that's not possible. I mean, that argument has been made. And sure, it may be there are fundamental limits to what human organisms can know. I mean, that's not impossible. That's a Kantian argument, that there's a limit. But I think we're going to get much further by studying the brain I think there's a limit to what you can do with behavior genetics. I think what we've done in behavior genetics is point out what biological organisms were created by genes. They're terribly important. We've got to understand how the whole system works. And, you know, there are genes, brains, and behavior. And the linkages are unknown, almost. I mean, I tell my students, this is a fascinating time to be a scientist. There are just all kinds of fascinating questions that we have the vaguest answer to. This is in contrast with John Horgan, who said the end of science, you know. Yeah.
The heritability analyses that you do partition behaviour into things that are due to additive genes and shared environment and unique environment. What if you could comment on what surprises people when they look at the outcomes of those studies that indicate that even though we all believe the family is important, and we've just heard you for the last hour talking about the critical elements of your environment, why C is 0 and what's in E, and what explains why people think that C should be greater than 0?
Well,
Dave, repeat the question.
When you partition variance, what explains that C should be 0?
Well, actually, it's an empirical matter as to whether C is going to be 0 or not. And in fact, there are domains where C is not 0. So that proves that the methods will detect it if it's an important component. But what you have to remember is variance analysis doesn't deal with means. It deals with variances. So if I took everybody here, let's go back to when you were born, and we put you in the Pleistocene, you don't go to school, et cetera, but somebody develops IQ tests, I don't think any of your IQs are going to be anywhere near where they are today. So we're ignoring the main effect of the environment. We're only looking at variance. And so I think people are making that confusion. They say, oh, my mother provided me with food. I mean, if you didn't eat, you wouldn't grow. And if we didn't die, we'd be stunted if we were starving. So we certainly need adequate environment to express our genotypes. Our genotypes have developed to be expressed in what's called the average expected environment. That's how evolution works. And if the environment gets too hot, our brains burn up and we die. If the environment gets too cold, we freeze. We can exist within only a particular range of environment. And our genotypes are suited to those environments. But they have to be there. They have to be good enough. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Nate?
Tom, I'd like to ask a follow-up on that. David Rowe and Turkheimer, among others, have argued that C is higher and that heritability is lower for things like intelligence, for individuals who are reared families whose parents have had very little formal education. What's your take on that?
Yeah,
your twin stuff.
It's perfectly possible. Turkheimer and Gottesman and Donofrio have a nice paper on that. That particular paper completely confounds race and social class, however. That's a completely confounded paper. I mean, Herb's a good friend. My wife and his wife play golf together. I mean, but I tell him I would not have published that paper, and I wouldn't have accepted it if I'd have been the reviewer. So that's a complete confound. But it's perfectly plausible, and I think people ought to do the studies to there's no
You
question
have,
about it.
you got the same feeling about Roe's data on the reanalysis of the national longitudinal?
Yeah, but their samples are funny. You know, they weren't able to, I mean, they're estimating what the relationships are, et cetera. So again, it's not, you know, and it's a study that could be done. And somebody must be doing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're doing it, probably the TED study would be able to answer that question, yeah. I'm gonna go with the data. Let's do it. I'm perfectly happy to do it. And there's no question. I tell my students, look, heritability doesn't tell you anything about immutability. I said, I take a little infant, I bang him on the head enough, I'm going to cause brain damage, he's going to have a low IQ. We don't have to do studies of that. So our questions about heritability really ought to be focused on a reasonable range of environments. We ought to be able to talk about it that way. But people who criticize behavior genetics are kind of saying, well, you know what happens if, you know, you grow up in a barrel? They'll have an argument. Yeah. Well, we know if you grow up in a barrel, first, nobody's going to be able to feed you. You're not going to be able to read. You're going to have a very low IQ if you survive. But that's like saying, well, what would happen if you grew up in the center of the sun? You know, nobody would. So what we have to do is get some sense of what's a reasonable range of environments to talk about. And then that answers the question. I know no behavior geneticist says all kinds of trauma will have no effect. No, trauma will have effects. There's no doubt about that. So extreme environments, by definition, we just know. We don't have to do experiments. And but the correlational data and quantitative genetics gives us a lot of information that molecular genetics doesn't. Quantitative genetics tells us why relatives are similar and why relatives are different. And it gives us nice models of how evolution works. Just pure molecular genetics saying, well, they got this gene there, and you see. The genes are transferred from parents to offspring, to siblings, etc. And explaining those relationships is an important scientific problem. Quantitative genetics does that. And it's anticipated in molecular genetics and all kinds of things. It's very, very powerful theory. But it's a theory, and it's not fully developed. It has areas that could be better developed. But I don't think molecular genetics will ever, actually to answer Frank's question more, you know, the genetic correlation between all kinds of traits is unknown. One of the things we've just done some big modeling and have a theory of intelligence. We're now in the process of, if I can convince Wendy to do the work, we're going to do the same with personality. And then we're going to do the same with vocational interests. And then we're going to do the same with attitudes. And then we can ask, what are the covariances among all of these things? And what are the genetic covariances and the environmental covariances? Now, we don't have a big enough sample to really do it, but technically that's what a quantitative behavior geneticist would do with the domain of individual differences. They take what are the major theories and the major constructs at all levels across these domains, and then how are they interrelated? Is our vocational interest really completely different from personality and ability? And where they're not, where they're correlated, are those correlations due to genetic factors, the way the brain is put together, or are they due to environmental experiences, etc.? We don't have much knowledge about that.
Art?
Do you believe that the within-family component of environment is a largely random affair, or do you think that it can be analyzed systematically? What does it consist of? What's your best take on what the within-family environment consists of?
What is your best take on what the within-family environment is?
Well, in theory, it seems to me one could analyze it. If you could watch what every mother and every father and every sibling did, what the interactions are, and then did this for huge samples, you might get something systematic out of the data. But you might not. So I don't know the answer, but it would be a horrendously difficult undertaking, and I'm not sure it's worth it. I think, it does tend to approximate randomness. I think parents have all kinds of things they have to worry about, and that they pay attention to their children, but they're not, in most instances, trying to do anything systematic. They're trying to keep the kid alive, they're trying to keep the kid fed, they're trying to keep the kid clean, and that's why most of the relationship we see is genetic, not environmental, because so many other things are taking place, important things. We tend to think, well, the shaping of kids' personality or their vocational interests are terribly important. No, keeping them alive, keeping them fed, keeping them safe, keeping them clean. And to bring Judith Harris in, trying to influence them in terms of what other kids they play with is fundamentally important. Parents actually are very, very concerned with this. Who your friends are. You know, I don't like that friend. I'm surprised there's not a lot more focus on that. And in fact, Judith Harris, I think, correctly pointed out, peers have enormous influence on kids. And we don't have a good theoretical frame of reference for analyzing that. There are a few developmental psychologists who work with peer relations, but within the context of behavior genetics, that's another area that we could branch out to. So I do think there's a lot of kind of randomness. Whatever has to be done at any given moment is what a mother does or a father does, or actually a sibling does. So I don't believe there's a lot of systematicity in there.
Parents do move, though. I mean, I remember you telling me once one of the reasons you moved from California was because the kids were young and the drug culture, and parents moved to
you seek out a
better
different niche.
schools and stuff.
Sure, and that doesn't get captured well, because you spend part-time here, part-time there, etc. There's a place where you have deficiencies in the model, actually. And you could build that kind of thing into a model if you had a huge enough population and could get that built. But you know, we cut things at very crude levels. For example, we were reading a paper in a seminar the other day, Mapping Youth seminar, in fact, about how mobility was a bad thing. These were studies of lower class families, and they were saying the families that had to move were suffering. The kids were suffering more behavioral problems. The parents had problems, and they were arguing moves are not a good thing. They're hard on people. On the other hand, when I was a student at Berkeley, Don McKinnon was studying creative architects, and one of the most salient things that jumped out of that data was the most creative architects had actually moved. Their families had moved many times, and they had a greater diversity of experiences. So here in this frame of reference, lots of different exposure was a positive kind of thing in this other context. So I use this as an example in my classes. What you're really after is an underlying construct, not moving. There's the construct in the architects was greater and greater exposure to the environment, and you didn't want to just get it by moving, you wanted to get it in other ways. And for people in a very, very poor environment, moving is not a matter. What's going on probably is the kids are causing difficulty, the mother's causing difficulty, and the landlord's kicking them out. And so they're creating means a totally different thing. So a particular indicator is worthless. What an indicator has got to do is be linked to a construct, and then you've got to have multiple indicators. So we have to create proper constructs, and I don't think we even have any idea what the constructs ought to be for within family variants. Actually, there are probably a good number of them, but my gut feeling is it's just a lot of randomness.
One more question?
I guess I tired everybody out.
Tired them all out. Okay, Tom, this was fun. Thank you.
An Alportian ideographic experience.